In the dense swamplands of South Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds and the air feels heavy with old, unconfessed things, there are ruins most people pass without looking twice. A collapsed foundation, a scatter of brick, a path swallowed by cattails and black water. Locals once called it the Angel's Rest Chapel. Between 1789 and 1832, more than 1,200 souls vanished after seeking refuge there. Men and women driven by hunger, fear, and that last fragile belief that somewhere in the Low Country, mercy might still exist. For nearly a century, it was treated as folklore, a ghost story told on porches when the night grew too quiet. Then, in 1923, church records surfaced. Ledger books found sealed inside a rotting chest, their pages protected from damp by oilcloth and prayer. They were taken into custody, reviewed, and immediately locked away. Authorities called them sensitive. Historians were told to let it go. But the ink didn't lie. Those books documented systematic murder, methodical, profitable, disguised as divine mercy. They named the Whitworth family pillars of their community, and the private faith they cultivated behind polite smiles, the Order of Fallen Angels. On their plantation, they built a chapel that wasn't a sanctuary at all, but a killing ground. One of the most efficient in the antebellum South. What you're about to hear was buried for nearly 2 centuries. But the truth about America's most sinister religious family can't remain hidden forever. Before we step into the Whitworth legacy, understand this isn't a story meant for everyone. It's for those willing to sit with the darkest chapters of American history without looking away. If you're ready to walk with us, join the community, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We need to know how far these shadows travel. Now, step back into 1789, into South Carolina, where salvation came with a price no soul should ever pay. To understand how such careful evil could flourish, you have to look at the world that made it possible. The year was 1789. The United States was newly formed, still bleeding from the wounds of revolution, stitched together with ideals on paper and violence in practice. In the South Carolina Low Country, where rice plantations stretched toward the Atlantic like a green empire, the social order remained as rigid as the tides that flooded the marshes twice a day. Freedom was a word spoken loudly in cities and quietly denied in fields. It was here, 30 miles inland from Charleston, that the Whitworth family carved out their dominion of deception. Gabriel Whitworth was 43 when he purchased the 1,000-acre tract he would name Seraphim's Grace. He stood 6 feet tall, prematurely silver-haired, with eyes the color of winter ice. He carried himself like a man accustomed to obedience, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make others feel small. When he did speak, the sound was cultured and resonant, the kind that could fill a chapel or reduce a grown man to trembling silence. Born into Virginia's collapsing planter aristocracy, Gabriel had watched his family's tobacco fortune decay during the Revolutionary War. Where others saw ruin, he saw a door opening. He stepped through it with a calm certainty that should have warned everyone. His wife, Constance Whitworth, born Constance Napton, came from old Charleston money, wealth built in the shadow markets of the slave trade and rice cultivation. At 38, she remained striking in a fragile, ethereal way that reminded visitors of porcelain dolls. Dark hair always arranged, pale hands untouched by honest work. But those who lingered on her face too long noticed something unsettling in her brown eyes. A vacant distance, as if part of her mind had retreated somewhere unreachable, somewhere safer than the world she lived in. The Whitworth children were each remarkable in their own disturbing way. Ezekiel, 24, the heir apparent, possessed his father's calculating intelligence, but sharpened into a cruelty that even Gabriel sometimes found excessive. Tall and lean, his smile never reached his dark eyes. He'd studied briefly at the College of Charleston, until Gabriel called him home to manage the family's more delicate operations. Miriam, 22, was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Where her brothers relied on intimidation, Miriam worked with charm. She could make a desperate runaway feel entirely safe while guiding them, gently and patiently, to their own death. She was conventionally beautiful, golden hair, blue eyes, a sweet smile. But there was something in her manner that suggested she took genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. The twins, Cain and Abel, had just turned 20. Cain was larger, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked built for strangling. Abel was slighter, more thoughtful, and far more frightening for it. His intelligence didn't wander into art or philosophy. It focused itself on devising new ways to extract information from unwilling mouths. They'd been raised to see themselves as instruments of divine justice, and they approached their work with the patient precision of craftsmen. Young Lilith, only 16, was still being shaped into her place within the family enterprise. Blonde like her sister, but with her father's piercing gaze, she carried an unsettling maturity that made visitors uncomfortable. Gabriel was grooming her to inherit Miriam's duties when the time came. The family business required continuity. Gabriel's brother, Michael Whitworth, served as official overseer and closest collaborator. 2 years younger than Gabriel, he wore the weathered look of a man who spent his days in the field, but his education matched his brother's. He understood their operation required both brutality and careful record-keeping. Michael's wife Ruth had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, leaving him with twin daughters, Mercy and Grace, now 13. The girls lived in the main house with their cousins, receiving the same careful education in the family's particular brand of theology. The youngest brother, Raphael Whitworth, who insisted everyone call him Seraph, was 35, and perhaps the most chilling member of them all. Thin to the point of gauntness, with prematurely white hair and pale green eyes, Seraph had studied medicine at Edinburgh before the Revolution. He never practiced legitimate medicine. He used his knowledge differently, keeping victims alive longer during interrogations, ensuring bodies could be sold to medical schools while appearing to have died of natural causes. The plantation itself had been designed for their purposes, with quiet intention. The main house, an imposing 3-story Georgian structure, sat on a slight rise overlooking the rice fields. But it was the smaller buildings that mattered. The chapel, completed in 1788, stood half a mile from the main house, connected by a winding path through ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was larger than most plantation chapels, room for 200 worshippers, though the Whitworth congregation rarely exceeded 50 locals. What made it unique were the modifications Gabriel ordered during construction. Behind the altar, hidden from casual eyes, was a door. It led downward into a basement designed not for storage, but for confinement, a series of holding cells. Thick walls muffled screams. A ventilation system ensured occupants could be kept alive for extended periods. Adjacent to the chapel stood what appeared to be a simple outbuilding for religious materials. In truth, it housed Seraph's medical laboratory and the tools of his trade. In 1789, the Whitworths founded their Order of Fallen Angels, presenting it to the community as a Methodist revival movement devoted to bringing salvation to the desperate. They held regular services, inviting neighboring planters and their families to witness Gabriel's sermons. Passionate, eloquent, filled with scripture and redemption through suffering. The local Methodist circuit rider, Reverend Thomas Hartwell, initially welcomed their zeal. He even allowed Gabriel to conduct special services for seekers in spiritual distress. But the order's true purpose had nothing to do with salvation. Through a network of contacts in Charleston, Savannah, and as far north as Richmond, the Whitworths began spreading carefully crafted rumors. Word reached slave quarters throughout the region that Angel's Rest was a sanctuary, a place where runaways could find food, shelter, and guidance to freedom. The stories were detailed enough to feel true. Descriptions of the chapel's location, passwords to identify genuine seekers, testimonials from supposed escapees who had made it north. It was an elaborate deception, and it demanded coordination. Serif maintained correspondence with medical schools in Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, even Philadelphia, establishing himself as a reliable supplier of cadavers for anatomical study. The bodies were always presented as free persons of color who had died of natural causes, complete with forged documentation. In the early Republic, medical schools asked few questions. Serif's prices were always reasonable. Michael handled the practical machinery, managing the legitimate plantation business that served as cover, maintaining informants who kept the sanctuary rumor alive, coordinating with professional slave catchers who helped identify valuable targets. The rice plantation itself was moderately successful. Nearly 100 enslaved workers lived there, in conditions that, compared to neighboring plantations, seemed almost merciful. Better food, better housing, limited movement around the property. That reputation of benevolence was carefully cultivated. It was part of the trap. And the most diabolical aspect of the Whitworth operation was how they used genuine religious faith as a weapon. Gabriel's sermons were powerful, moving, theologically sophisticated. He could make an educated listener nod along, even as he laid the groundwork for cruelty. He truly believed he was doing God's work, convinced the souls he sent to their deaths were predestined for damnation anyway. That belief gave the family permission, in their own minds, to murder without seeing themselves as monsters. Local authorities sensed something unusual at Seraphim's Grace, but the Whitworths had made themselves untouchable. Gabriel served on the county commission, contributed generously to local churches, hosted elaborate gatherings that cemented their place in planter society. When questions arose, missing slaves, strangers seen near the marsh, the Whitworths expressed appropriate concern and offered to help with searches. Then came the autumn of 1791. Storms battered the low country, ruining crops and tightening chains. Economic hardship pushed more enslaved people to run. For the Whitworths, it was opportunity. In a single month, 43 desperate souls arrived at Angel's Rest Chapel seeking sanctuary, and it was during this period that the family's methods became refined into something colder than cruelty. A system. Miriam always met them first. She would appear at the chapel door like an answered prayer, calm, composed, her voice soft enough to make the frightened lean closer. She offered food, clean clothing, a place to rest where the night couldn't reach them. She explained gently that the family needed to verify their stories before guiding them north. It was for their protection, she said, to guard the Underground Railroad network, to ensure no one had been followed. In those first days, the victims didn't feel hunted. They felt held, and while they ate, while they exhaled, while they let their shoulders drop for the first time in weeks, the Whitworths began gathering intelligence with the ease of practiced predators. Miriam had a gift for drawing out secrets in conversation that felt harmless. Names of family members left behind. Which plantation they fled. Who had helped them slip away. Planned meeting points. Routes through the swamps. The names of conductors in the north spoken like prayers. Gabriel visited daily, presenting himself as a shepherd. He conducted prayer services that slowly coaxed more details from each person's history. He spoke of deliverance, of bondage, of the Lord's hand guiding the oppressed, language that wrapped itself around the desperate like a warm blanket. Under his attention, people confessed without realizing they were confessing. Cain and Abel played their part as well. They posed as runaways from distant plantations, sharing carefully fabricated stories of successful escapes. They laughed at the right moments. They offered the kind of camaraderie that makes strangers feel like kin. In that borrowed trust, the victims spoke more freely, believing they were among allies. Lilith, still young, hovered at the edges like innocence made flesh, another gentle face, another reason to believe. Once the family had extracted everything of value, the tone shifted, quietly, almost politely. Victims were moved to the chapel's basement under the guise of preparations, a private blessing, a secure waiting place, a necessary precaution. Some were led there at night so they wouldn't disturb other guests. Others were told it was safer underground, away from patrols and slave catchers. Few resisted. Why would they? They had been fed, prayed over, spoken to with kindness. And when the hidden door behind the altar opened, it did not reveal sanctuary. It revealed a descent. The basement held 5 individual cells at first, stone, shackled, designed to prevent any possibility of escape. Soundproofing was so effective that worshippers above could sing hymns while suffering unfolded directly beneath their feet. The ventilation kept bodies alive longer. The air was damp, stale, heavy with human breath and fear. Serif's medical training made him invaluable here. He did not torture like a brute. He worked like a man conducting a procedure. He understood pressure points, nerve pathways, the fine border between pain and unconsciousness. He could keep someone responsive far longer than crude violence ever could. He could break resistance without leaving obvious marks that might reduce the value of the body later. His hands were calm, his voice clinical, the questions precise. Abel assisted, taking notes with unsettling patience, cross-referencing details with previous testimonies. If a name appeared twice, it was marked. If a route repeated, it was mapped. The basement wasn't just a place of murder, it was an intelligence chamber. And Ezekiel refined the larger system. He developed categories for new arrivals based on value. Young, healthy males were kept alive longest. Their knowledge of plantation defenses, patrol patterns, and escape routes could be sold to professional slave catchers for premium sums. Women with children were questioned about other families planning to flee, their desperation making them more likely to talk. Older escapees, those with less useful information, were dispatched quickly, minimizing resources spent on their maintenance. It was efficient, it was cold, it was business, and it was recorded. Gabriel maintained ledgers, meticulous documentation that turned human lives into numbered entries. Each victim was assigned an identification number, a file, a complete account. Physical description, background, intelligence gathered, ultimate disposition. The records tracked patterns in escape routes, identified key figures in the Underground Railroad, and produced reports valuable enough to be considered currency in the underworld. The Whitworths had established partnerships with 3 major slave-catching operations, spanning from Virginia to Georgia. These bounty hunters paid for details: safe houses, planned flights, names of conductors. A single raid based on Whitworth intelligence could generate thousands of dollars. The money was split among the family and their partners with the same cheerless fairness you'd use to divide harvested crops. But the body trade was the most consistent profit. Sharif's correspondence with medical schools had grown into a sophisticated supply network. Bodies were preserved using techniques he learned in Edinburgh, packed into specially designed containers, shipped with forged documents identifying them as free persons of color who had died of fever or other natural causes. The family earned between $50 and $100 per body, depending on the specimen's condition, the institution's needs, and how much discretion was required. And medical schools, hungry for cadavers, asked few questions. The most horrifying element was how easily the Whitworths maintained their public face. Every Sunday, they attended services at the local Methodist church. Gabriel often served as a lay preacher, his voice lifting scripture like a lantern. They hosted dinner parties, donated to charities, participated in every social ritual expected of prominent planters. Constance became known for her needlework and her skill organizing the ladies' auxiliary functions. She smiled at the right moments. She accepted compliments with quiet grace. And yet, those who watched closely sometimes saw her gaze drift, far away, as if her mind lived in a separate room no one else could enter. By 1795, the Whitworth operation had expanded beyond anything Gabriel originally envisioned. What began as an opportunistic scheme had hardened into a criminal enterprise spanning 4 states. Their success attracted others, men who believed brutality was a necessary tool for maintaining order, men who saw profit and called it providence. Out of that attraction, a larger network formed. They called it the Southern Redemption Society. Its membership included plantation owners, merchants, professional slave catchers, corrupt officials, even a few ministers who shared Gabriel's twisted theology. Monthly meetings rotated locations, disguised as religious revivals or respectable social gatherings. Dues were paid based on profits, and those funds were used to expand operations and ensure officials who might interfere remained persuaded. Dr. Edmund Thorne, a physician in Charleston, became one of their most valuable members. His legitimate credentials allowed him to provide death certificates for bodies Serif supplied. Thorne also had connections with ship captains who transported specimens to northern institutions, keeping the supply line quiet. Captain Marcus Fulton controlled a network of slave catchers operating through the Carolinas and Georgia. His men specialized in tracking specific individuals based on Whitworth intelligence. Fulton's captures were often brutal, entire families taken at once. He paid the Whitworths a percentage of every reward collected through their information. Perhaps most disturbing was Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a Methodist minister whose territory included 3 counties in eastern South Carolina. Blackwood used his pastoral position to identify potential escapees within his congregation, feeding that information to the Whitworths. He could speak comfort over a frightened soul, and then guide them toward a door that led underground. He even conducted funeral services for some victims, claiming they'd died of fever, his face solemn as he spoke words he did not mean. As the society grew, their methods became more sophisticated. Gabriel developed a coded communication system, letters filled with spiritual language that carried hidden intelligence. Discussions of redemption contained maps of escape routes. References to souls in distress marked planned flights. Prayers became coordinates. These coded letters would be discovered years later, revealing a network far more extensive than any single plantation. Sharif evolved as well, becoming something like a forensic analyst long before such a term existed. He built profiles of escape patterns, identified seasonal variations, and used that knowledge to position resources more effectively. The society intercepted escapees before they could reach genuine safe houses, collapsing routes like bones snapped under pressure. The Whitworth Chapel became a training ground. Gabriel held seminars on theological justification, how to rationalize atrocity through selective scripture. Sharif provided medical instruction, how to extract information without leaving obvious evidence. Miriam taught manipulation techniques, showing new recruits how to make victims cooperate willingly, how to turn hope into a leash. During the expansion, the Whitworths processed an average of 60 victims per year. The basement was enlarged, 12 cells now, not 5. More soundproofing installed. A new crematorium constructed, disguised as a pottery kiln, to dispose of remains that couldn't be profitably sold. 6 additional workers were brought into the operation, all society members, all vetted for silence and loyalty. Lilith, now 18, became fully integrated. Her specialty was female victims, particularly those traveling with children. She cultivated a maternal persona, soft voice, gentle touch, lullabies whispered in the dark. She cared for the children while their parents were interrogated. Sometimes she used threats against the young ones to encourage cooperation. Her complete lack of empathy, hidden behind a nurturing mask, made her one of the most effective instruments the family had ever produced. Cain handled the physical logistics, maintenance, transportation, disposal of evidence. Abel focused on intelligence analysis, keeping records that turned suffering into profit. Together, they created an efficient system capable of processing victims within 48 hours of arrival, maximizing revenue while minimizing risk. But the society's success began to cast a shadow even beyond the South. Abolitionists in the North started noticing patterns. Newspaper articles mentioned an unusual number of runaways who vanished completely after leaving South Carolina plantations. Underground railroad conductors reported losing contact with escapees who had been directed to safe houses in the region. It was a whisper at first, an absence that didn't make sense. And then, in the winter of 1798, someone came looking. His name was Jeremiah Morrison, a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia. He arrived in Charleston under the pretense of establishing trade relationships with rice planters. But beneath that respectable mask, he carried a different purpose. He was investigating for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Morrison was 45, weathered from years of dangerous travel, driven by a faith that demanded action rather than comfort. He had helped escapees reach freedom before. He had learned to recognize deception not by what people said, but by what their stories refused to touch. And something about South Carolina felt wrong. His investigation began with interviews. Successful escapees in Philadelphia, New York, Boston. Again and again, the same details surfaced, whispers of a sanctuary called Angel's Rest. Some said they'd visited and left quickly, unable to explain why, only that the place felt wrong. Others had sent friends or family members there, and those people were never heard from again. Morrison documented everything. He cross-referenced dates, locations, descriptions. The pattern tightened like a noose. People were disappearing at a specific place in the Low Country, but proving it required infiltration. And Morrison knew his skin color made him unsuitable for such a mission. The solution came from an unexpected source: Samuel Washington, a free black man from Baltimore, educated in Pennsylvania, volunteered to go in. Light-skinned enough to plausibly pass as mixed race, educated enough to explain refined speech, fearless enough to walk toward a chapel rumored to swallow souls. He arrived in Charleston in March 1799 carrying forged documents identifying him as the property of a fictional Virginia planter. For weeks he worked as a day laborer, gathering information quietly, listening in the places where people lowered their voices. It didn't take long before he heard Angel's Rest spoken of in the way desperate people speak of miracles. Washington approached the operation carefully. He let word of his situation spread through the underground network. Within a month, a contact provided directions to the Whitworth plantation and the passwords needed to identify himself as a legitimate seeker. Meanwhile, Morrison embedded himself in Charleston's business circles. His legitimate merchant credentials opened doors to shipping records, medical college correspondence, documents that most people never considered dangerous. What he discovered chilled even his experienced mind. Shipping logs showed regular deliveries from South Carolina to medical schools throughout the mid-Atlantic. The volume was far too high to be explained by natural mortality among the region's free black population. Death certificates signed by local physicians followed suspicious patterns. Too many transient free black deaths attributed to fever and natural causes. Something was moving north from the South Carolina Lowcountry. Something packed in crates. Washington's mission began on a humid April evening when he approached Angel's Rest Chapel, following the instructions he'd been given. The building appeared exactly as described, larger than most plantation chapels, Gothic windows that looked strangely foreboding in the dying light. Spanish moss hung from surrounding oaks like funeral shrouds. The air smelled of stagnant water from nearby rice fields. Miriam Whitworth greeted him at the chapel door. Her smile was warm, welcoming. She was as beautiful as the stories promised. Golden hair, eyes that seemed to radiate compassion. But Washington felt a hard, immediate sense of danger. Something about her performance felt rehearsed, polished, practiced, as if she had welcomed hundreds before him. "You must be so tired, poor soul," she said, leading him inside. "Come, let me get you some food and a safe place to rest. Tomorrow we'll speak of your journey north." The chapel interior was more elaborate than Washington expected. Stained glass depicted scenes of divine judgment, unusually violent for a Methodist sanctuary. The altar was carved from dark wood. Behind it hung a painting of the Archangel Michael casting demons into hell. Everything about the space felt theatrical, as if designed not to comfort, but to intimidate. Washington was fed and given clean clothes. He was shown to a small room adjacent to the chapel. Miriam repeated the same gentle explanation. The family needed to verify his story before helping him continue. A precaution, a brief waiting period, rarely more than a few days. On his second day, he met Gabriel. The patriarch presented himself as benevolent, offering spiritual guidance to the desperate. His sermons were powerful, filled with liberation and redemption language that felt perfectly tailored to his audience. But Washington noticed details that made his skin tighten. Other guests seemed unusually subdued. They spoke in whispers, avoided eye contact. When Washington tried to ask about their travel plans, they gave vague, inconsistent answers. Most disturbing was the way they looked at the Whitworth family, with a mixture of gratitude and terror, like people who had been saved and branded. On the third night, Washington woke to sounds that froze his blood. Muffled screams. They came from somewhere beneath the chapel, barely audible through thick walls, but unmistakably human. He lay perfectly still, listening as the cries rose and fell, then faded into a silence that felt even worse. When he mentioned the sounds the next morning, the other guests claimed to have heard nothing. Washington understood then. He was inside the mouth of something that had been feeding for years. He began observing carefully: layout of buildings, patterns of movement, the number of family members, the way the outbuilding near the chapel was guarded with casual attention. He searched for signs of what happened to those who arrived at Angel's Rest and never left. The breakthrough came when he saw Sharif loading a wagon with wooden crates. The crates were the right size, the right shape. They were handled like valuable cargo, with care that didn't belong to mere supplies. Washington followed at a distance as the wagon moved toward a landing on the Ashley River. A small steamboat waited there, but Washington was not the only one watching. Abel noticed his curiosity and reported it. Gabriel decided their guest had become too inquisitive, and so the sanctuary doors opened wider, not to let Washington out, but to take him down. His descent into the chapel basement revealed the true scope of the Whitworth evil. The underground facility was far more sophisticated than he imagined. 12 individual cells now, a medical laboratory, and what appeared to be a crematorium. The smell of death hung in the air like a physical presence. The walls bore stains no amount of scrubbing could remove. He was placed in a cell marked by evidence of previous occupants. Scratches carved into stone by desperate fingernails, dark smears Washington refused to name. The space was barely large enough to lie down. No furniture, only a bucket for waste, and a small opening near the ceiling for minimal air. Within hours, he heard other prisoners whispering through the cracks of the walls. Their voices carried the truth. Some had been there for weeks, kept alive only long enough to surrender information. Escape routes, contacts, planned flights. Others were newer and still clung to hope that they might be released. The interrogations began immediately. Sharif worked with surgical precision, asking detailed questions while applying controlled pain. Washington's education and intelligence made him especially valuable. They suspected connections to abolitionists, and they wanted information about funding, organization, names. Hours blurred into hours. But Washington had been prepared for this possibility. His training in Philadelphia included instruction on resisting interrogation. His faith gave him a steadiness his captors didn't understand. He fed them false information mixed with enough truth to seem believable, buying time while searching for an opening. That opening came from an unexpected source. Grace Whitworth, one of Michael's 13-year-old twin daughters, brought food to the prisoners as part of her education. Unlike her relatives, Grace seemed disturbed by the suffering around her. Washington spoke to her during these brief visits, gently, carefully, building trust and planting doubt. Grace was intelligent enough to recognize wrong, but she'd been raised to believe the victims were predestined for damnation anyway. Washington countered her family's doctrine with a different theology, one built on mercy, on the dignity of souls. Slowly, her certainty began to fracture. More importantly, she began to see him as human. She agreed to leave Washington's cell unlocked during her next delivery, giving him access to the laboratory where Sharif kept his instruments. Armed with a scalpel, Washington would need to move through the plantation at night, avoid family and workers, reach the Ashley River, and steal a boat. But the plan unraveled almost immediately. Grace's unusual behavior caught the attention of her sister Mercy, who reported it to their father. When Washington stepped into the corridor beyond his cell, Abel was waiting with a pistol and a vicious smile. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Abel asked, gesturing back toward the darkness. Poor little Grace thought she was saving your soul. Instead, she's ensured your death will be much more unpleasant than we originally planned." Washington was returned to his cell, but the failed escape revealed something important. There were cracks inside the Whitworth unity. Grace's willingness to help suggested doubts could exist even in a house built on cruelty, and the incident forced the family to accelerate their timeline. That night, Washington heard voices in the laboratory. Gabriel and Serif. They discussed how best to handle their problematic prisoner. Gabriel wanted more information before killing him. Serif argued Washington was too dangerous to keep alive. They decided on one final interrogation, methods that would likely prove fatal. But Washington had one more card to play. During weeks of captivity, he had memorized everything: the layout of the facility, names and faces, details of the operation. He'd also listened to other prisoners, building a mental map of the Underground Railroad network the Whitworths were destroying. When Serif arrived for the final session, Washington offered a bargain. He would provide detailed information about abolitionist financing and organization in exchange for a quick death rather than prolonged torture. The offer made Serif pause. Intelligence of that kind would be valuable to their society partners. What Serif didn't know was that Washington was buying time. Because Jeremiah Morrison, alarmed by Washington's disappearance, had begun making discreet inquiries. He'd connected with other abolitionists in Charleston, including free black workers who had heard whispers about the plantation. And they were coming. The rescue arrived at dawn on a humid June morning, when fog from the Ashley River rolled in thick and low, turning the world into a ghost. Morrison's small team moved under its cover. Weeks of planning, studying the plantation's layout, tracking likely access points. The group included Morrison, 2 other Quakers, and 4 free black men from Charleston who had volunteered for the mission, knowing they might not return. They set a diversionary fire in one of the rice processing buildings. As the Whitworths and their workers rushed to contain it, Morrison's team infiltrated the chapel and found the hidden entrance. What they discovered below exceeded their worst fears. 11 prisoners were still alive in the underground cells, including Washington, barely conscious, bloodied by his final interrogation. The laboratory contained ledgers documenting over 800 murders, correspondence with medical schools across the Mid-Atlantic, and maps of Underground Railroad routes compromised by information extracted from victims. But the most horrifying discovery was Serif's medical journal. It detailed torture techniques with clinical fascination. It documented what he called enhanced interrogation research, testing physical and psychological limits, recording outcomes like a scholar, using living people as subjects. The team planned to flee immediately, but Washington insisted on gathering evidence. Even injured, he understood the truth needed weight. Documents, proof, names. Morrison's men collected what they could, preparing survivors for transport. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the fire was controlled, and the Whitworths realized the underground chamber had been breached. And when Gabriel finally understood what had happened, he didn't panic, because he had built his empire expecting exactly this moment. Gabriel Whitworth had always planned for betrayal. As smoke thinned over the rice fields and shouts carried through the plantation, he moved with the calm of a man executing a rehearsed ritual. Escape routes had been mapped years earlier. Sensitive documents already had duplicates stored elsewhere. And most importantly, he had allies, men in robes, uniforms, and offices who owed him favors they could never repay publicly. When Morrison's evidence reached local authorities, It was dismissed as abolitionist fabrication, dangerous propaganda meant to inflame sectional tensions. Officials who hesitated were reminded quietly who funded their elections and protected their reputations. Federal authorities in Charleston showed interest, but their hands were tied. The crimes had occurred entirely within South Carolina. State sovereignty closed like a coffin lid. Even the Methodist hierarchy recoiled from the truth. Reverend Hartwell, who had once welcomed Gabriel's ministry, dismissed the allegations as a northern conspiracy to undermine Southern Christianity. Faith proved more loyal to power than to conscience. Within 6 months, the Whitworths sold Seraphim's Grace and vanished west. They resurfaced in Alabama territory, raw, lawless, and hungry for men like Gabriel. There, 20 miles north of Mobile, along the Tombigbee River, they built New Seraphim, a plantation more ambitious than its predecessor, a chapel more refined, an underground facility capable of holding 30 prisoners at once. Territorial oversight was weak, federal authority weaker still. Gabriel moved quickly, cultivating officials with donations and dinners. Within 2 years, he held a seat on the Territorial Council. His influence over law enforcement became direct, intimate, unquestioned. The new chapel was a masterpiece of deception, designed by a New Orleans architect to appear humble while concealing an underground complex with improved soundproofing, ventilation, and a laboratory that surpassed even Serif's earlier work. But the family had learned from Charleston. False sanctuaries alone were too risky, so they diversified. Gabriel obtained a legal license as a slave trader. On paper, it was legitimate commerce. In practice, it was camouflage. He specialized in what he called problem slaves, those who resisted, planned escape, or possessed valuable skills. They were bought cheaply, interrogated brutally, then sold to remote plantations where escape was nearly impossible. Ezekiel refined the method further. He began purchasing enslaved people solely to extract information, routes, names, networks, then reselling them far away. Profit and intelligence fused into a single transaction. The Alabama network grew faster than South Carolina's ever had. Many officials were settlers from Georgia and the Carolinas, already sympathetic to extreme measures. Planters became informal partners. Intelligence flowed inward. Money flowed out. Miriam married Captain James Patterson, a former naval officer who commanded a riverboat called the Sweet Salvation. The name was not irony, it was doctrine. The boat became central to the family's transportation network, moving bodies north and captives south with equal discretion. Lilith, now 22, became the family's most effective operative. Her beauty and apparent innocence made her irresistible across social classes. Boat captains, merchants, even federal officials believed themselves her singular romantic interest. Through them, she gathered intelligence, escape plans, abolitionist activity, whispers of investigation. Kane opened a blacksmith shop in Mobile, specializing in restraints and transport equipment for slave traders. Abel dealt in curious medical specimens, supplying anatomical oddities to collectors in the North and Europe. And Serif crossed a threshold. His years of torture gave him knowledge few physicians possessed. He began what he called enhanced medical research, using prisoners as living test subjects. His journals described procedures no legitimate doctor would attempt, experiments that anticipated some of the worst crimes of later centuries. By 1805, the Alabama operation processed 80 victims per year, and still, the shadows followed them. Jeremiah Morrison never stopped. Haunted by Charleston, he tracked the family relentlessly. His reports to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society painted a picture so vast it bordered on disbelief. The Whitworths had become a symbol, proof of how far slavery's defenders would go. His findings reached Washington. Secretary of State James Madison grew concerned, not out of compassion, but fear. Criminal enterprises, this extensive threatened national stability. But federal authority in territorial Alabama was limited. Unless interstate commerce or treaties were violated, local power ruled. The breakthrough came from Samuel Washington. Still bearing scars from Charleston, he built a network inside the slave trade. Boat captains, warehouse hands, overseers sickened by what they'd seen. Through them, he learned the Whitworths planned massive expansion. Contracts with medical schools in New Orleans, Richmond, even Boston. Nearly 200 deaths per year. Worse still, Gabriel was recruiting partners across Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, false sanctuaries, legitimate fronts, an industrial system of killing. Morrison understood then, law would not stop this. Only exposure, only force. A plan formed, audacious, nearly suicidal. Volunteers would infiltrate the Alabama operation, gather evidence, and strike during a major gathering of the Southern Redemption Society. Capture leaders, seize records, shatter the network. Washington insisted on leading the infiltration. In autumn 1807, he arrived in Mobile with 3 others posing as slave traders from Georgia. Forged documents, references from plantations that didn't exist. His light skin and education allowed him to pass as a mixed-race agent. For weeks, they built credibility. Auctions, plantations, quiet conversations. In December, they were invited to New Seraphim. Gabriel greeted them with confidence born of years unpunished. He spoke openly of his methods, his profits, his theology. As the tour progressed, he revealed more: medical contracts, intelligence networks, divine justification. Washington recognized the same calm certainty, the same belief that murder was holy. The chapel's basement dwarfed Charleston's. Individual cells designed for different prisoners. Charts mapping knowledge gained from pain. Equipment that belonged in nightmares, not medicine. The family spoke casually about suffering. Lilith demonstrated restraints with a smile. Even Constance now participated. Focused, lucid, present. The visit coincided with the annual Southern Redemption Society gathering. Nearly 30 members arrived under cover of a religious revival. Plantation owners, merchants, slave catchers, ministers. Dr. Thorne returned from the Caribbean. Captain Fulton appeared again, reborn in Mississippi. Even Reverend Blackwood attended, sanctimony intact. Gabriel's opening address outlined his vision: expansion into Louisiana territory, new sanctuaries, industrial-scale redemption facilities. Serif presented his research: experiments testing human endurance, preservation methods for transatlantic shipment. European medical interest had grown, but the society felt pressure. Abolitionists, federal scrutiny. Their response was acceleration and elimination. Gabriel revealed a list: abolitionists, escaped slaves, investigators marked for removal, accidents, fevers, disappearances. Samuel Washington's name was there. So was Jeremiah Morrison's. What Gabriel didn't know was that Morrison was already in position. On January 15, 1808, before dawn, fog rolled in off the river. Morrison's team, abolitionists, federal marshals, soldiers from New Orleans, moved with military precision. Warrants signed by territorial judges who'd been convinced the Whitworths threatened federal authority. Simultaneous assaults on the main house and chapel. 17 prisoners were found alive underground. Washington secured Gabriel's office. What he found there defied comprehension. Ledgers documenting over 1,500 murders. Correspondence spanning 12 states and 3 foreign countries. Maps of compromised underground railroad routes. Gabriel's personal journal, justifying each death as divine necessity, recording prophets alongside prayers. Serif's laboratory contained preserved specimens, research notes describing living experiments, and letters from medical schools requesting specific trauma. Gabriel was captured. He did not deny anything. He justified it. Predestination, divine order, necessary suffering. The trials that followed exposed the limits of early American justice. Witnesses vanished. Others recanted. Local authorities obstructed. Defense funds poured in from planters claiming persecution. Gabriel Whitworth was executed in 1811. Most others escaped. Serif fled to Mexico, later rumored in Texas conducting similar experiments. Ezekiel, Cain, and Abel were released early and resumed criminal lives under new names. Miriam and Lilith vanished. Later whispers placed them in Mexico City, running a bordello that sold bodies to researchers. Constance was declared insane and died in an asylum. The Underground Railroad reeled. Routes were abandoned. Networks rebuilt. But the exposure galvanized abolition. Samuel Washington became a powerful speaker, his testimony breaking religious complacency. Jeremiah Morrison continued investigating until his death in 1825, haunted by what he'd seen. New Seraphim was abandoned. The chapel burned in 1815. Underground chambers remained. Historians estimate at least 1,800 deaths between 1789 and 1808. Likely more. The Whitworth legacy endures as a warning of faith weaponized, of respectability masking atrocity, of how easily evil organizes when protected by power. No monument marks their victims, only silence. And beneath forgotten soil, the echoes remain.